So we get to start a new book this week, Sefer Devarim, Parshat Devarim, and I'm going to ignore or avoid or step aside from some of the larger issues in terms of style, in terms of authorship, and such things. And what I really want to focus on is one specific thing. Let me just say something a little bit broader first, and then we'll get to the specific thing. In order to properly learn Sefer Devarim, you need to read through the whole thing, chart it, try to figure out how many speeches there are. Ideally, one long speech, 2 speeches, 3 speeches, when they're given, context, what the point is, and so on, which means that needs to be done. I'm not doing that. I'm leaving that for you. You have also the rest of the summer to keep yourselves busy. The second thing is, well, let me start that one again. I'm just going to go through the first chapter, really. And this is the introductory talk, which therefore I'm going to be able to ignore everything else. When I said in the beginning I'm going to ignore the authorship issues, is God speaking, is Moshe speaking? I mean, it sounds like Moshe is speaking. Is Moshe speaking based upon himself, based upon his own divine understanding? He's based upon his own prophecy. Is this divine ventriloquism? Is God speaking through Moshe? Which means that there's all kinds of, I'm going to call it authorship types of questions. Nonetheless, either because God told Moshe to say it or God told Moshe to write it, I mean, either way, it has authority of being Torah because God tells Moshe to write it. Now, where the words came from, so I'm saying that's a really interesting subject, but that's not what I'm talking about today. Nonetheless, I am going to go with the approach that Moshe is speaking because that is what it sounds like. And with that, let's begin. And the thing that I want to keep in mind, and this may be a little bit unfair, but I at least want to say it, so then when you say it, then it's less unfair than if you don't say it. And that is, here you have a leader during the last moments of his life, and that I'm exaggerating a little bit, which goes back to how much time is elapsing throughout the whole book. But here we are, a man who's led the people for 40 years, and now we're at the end of that. So some people, and now here's where I get a little bit into trouble. Moshe for us is a religious leader. A religious leader is not necessarily the same thing as a political or a military leader. It happens to be that Moshe was also, in a certain sense, to a great extent, he's a political leader also, and he's a military leader as well, which means I can't separate one from the other because Moshe really is all of those things. Moshe is a freedom fighter. Moshe is the man who takes us out of Egypt. So all of that is a part of it, even though all of us know from our Pesach experiences that Moshe is there in the back burner, and we're really focusing on God because God is using Moshe there as utensils. And for that matter, how often is God using Moshe as a utensil? Once again, by speaking through him and using him as the conduit whereby the word of God reaches the people. Nonetheless, if I were now to push the God issue on the side for a moment, and I'm saying that's where it's a little bit unfair, and speak about a leader making his last couple of speeches, in our world that we live in, and maybe it wasn't always that way, but I suspect it was even worse in the past, you would have somebody very concerned with their legacy. And all you need to do is just to think outside of this room for a second, and you realize that that's something which takes place very much. You'll be thinking about a legacy, and you want to set the tone about how that legacy is going to be reported and how it's going to be remembered, and really what were the contributions. And Moshe does some things over here which therefore are so unusual, and maybe this is part of what speaks to his greatness. But let's begin and read. I'm going to point out a couple of issues, and then we're going to try to focus on those issues. Eila Devarim asher diber Moshe el kol Yisrael be'ever Yarden ba'midbar ba'arava mulsuv ben paran ben tafel v'lavan v'chatzirot v'dei zahav, and it goes on, which means just giving you the context over here, right? Great deal of focus on the context, but nonetheless, we're much concerned with the first couple words. Eila Devarim asher diber Moshe el kol Yisrael. These are the things, these are the words that Moshe says to the whole people. And again, I skipped Pasuk Bet, Gimel, Dalet, and Hey. Be'ever Yarden, be'eretz Moav, hoil Moshe be'er et TORAH hazot lemor. Moshe explained the Torah, saying. Now, one of the things that people who don't actually read Sefer Devarim carefully think or maybe there's a different agenda. They think that what is it? It's called Mishnah Torah. It's the repetition of the Torah. So once again, in order to really evaluate that, take every single aspect of Torah that was stated prior to this, and take every single aspect of Torah which is stated in Devarim, and see statistically to what extent this is a repetition of the Torah. Right? There you go. You want more homework? There you go. You have a lot more homework to do. One of the things that you may find is that it's a little bit overstated. Second point is, we're going to spend this whole Parsha, you're going to be very hard-pressed to find a repetition really of any law. Maybe one. We could talk about one law if you want. Yes, one. We'll be happy with one. What you do have is a repetition of narrative. So right there, to divide between narrative and to divide between law is interesting, because so often people think about Sefer Devarim as the repetition of law. Okay, once again, how many new laws, how many old laws, how much repetition of narrative. Now, let's start all over again. If you're Moshe, and you are tasked with, and we don't know exactly what he's tasked with, and you are tasked with, or you decide that you want to tell over the story, where do you start the story? Where do you start telling it from? So I would say you could give a whole background of the book of Bereshit and how we got here, which he doesn't do. Which means Bereshit's not here. Bible scholars then drive themselves crazy. What does the Deuteronomist know or not know? Does he talk about the flood? Does he talk about the Akedah? Does he talk? He doesn't talk about Bereshit. Let's just leave that. He talks about one thing about Bereshit, and what's that? That God promised the land of Israel to Avram, Yitzchak, and Yaakov. And by the way, why is that? Because this book, like every other book, is about the land of Israel. That's the focus. Don't lose the focus. And I'm sorry for the Zionist overtones over here, but that is what's important. Which means we'll see how much so in a moment. Where are we? How did we get here? Where are we going? You don't need to go back and tell the whole story. There's really one issue over here. And what's interesting is really where he starts the story. Because I'll say it again. He could have started in Bereshit. He could have started from the moment where God spoke to him, which means by the burning bush, and then God appeared, which means, again, talk about your legacy, right? Try to craft, at the moment that God chose me and so on. I mean, you can imagine other people going and giving that speech. You could talk about how I took you out of Egypt. You can talk about, or you could talk about, you want to go back to the religious element, you could talk about, and we arrived at Sinai and God spoke to Sinai, especially if you're talking repetition of law. That's really where you should be focusing on, but that's not where we start. Let's continue. It says as follows, Pasuk Vav. Again, it's interesting because Hey is Bi'er et TORAH hazot, and explain the Torah. Now, the word Torah means instruction. Don't get fooled. Explain these instructions. Pasuk Vav, Hashem Elokeinu diber eleinu b'chorav le'mor. Stop right there, half of a pasuk. God at Sinai spoke to us. Now you realize he could have said a lot of things. He could have said Anochi, which by the way later on we're going to get to, right? Next week's parsha, we're going to get to a repetition of the Zerita Dibrot. But where does he start the story from, or the narrative from? God spoke to Chorav saying, Rab lechem shevet bahar hazeh. You spend too much time over here by this mountain. Why are you here so long? That's really interesting, because what's the starting point of the mountain? If you want, you continue. I skipped a little bit. Pasuk Ched, Re'ei natati lefnechem et haaretz. I've given you the land. Ba'u, get up, ureshua ta'aretz, go and inherit the land. Asher nishba Hashem lavotechem, which God promised to your forefathers, Avram, Yitzchak, Yaakov, l'teit lahem luzaram achareim, to give them and their descendants the land. So you see, the Bereshit just now got mentioned, one really narrow focus. What is it? Land of Israel. What's the beginning of the book? The beginning of the book is, why are you sitting here so long? By the way, we've been there for a while. Why we've been sitting? What? Don't listen to him. Don't listen to him. Why we've been sitting here so long, and we really should have been somewhere, and the place we should have been. Again, let's go back. I mentioned the burning bush as a possibility of where we could have started the story from. And the burning bush, Moshe received two separate, interrelated messages. One was, the first one, time to take the people out. Again, Brit Bein HaBetarim, keep in mind the covenant. I've promised the land, take them out and bring them straight to the land. The land was the issue. And then there was a second message, is, when you come out, you'll serve God on this mountain. Okay, and for how long? Don't answer me. For how long? How long should it have been? Now, the whole time with Paro, we kept telling him 3 days. We have no reason to suspect that we needed to spend more than 3 days by our whole Sinai experience. By the way, things happen. we all know rabbinically, at least, Moshe adds a day, right? We have 3 days of preparation. Moshe adds a day. We know that a couple of other things happen that people say, no, we don't want God speaking to us. It's too intense. We could die. No, talk to Moshe. And Moshe then subsequently goes up the mountain. And then what happens is, then they think that Moshe, 40 days go by, and they think that Moshe is dead. And then they make a golden calf. And then we have to go and try to fix the golden calf. And then we go and we build the Mishkan. And by the way, now you'll notice, back to my verse, we spend too much time by the mountain. How much time should we take? We should have been there, receive the word of God, and then get our marching orders and march straight. Don't pass go. Don't collect $200. Go straight. Go to the land of Israel, and that's the next stop. And over here, God is saying, you spent too much time over here. Now, this is not the kind of thing, listen, we all get company. People come to visit. People come for Shabbos. It's next Wednesday. They're still there. Sometimes you say, listen, you've spent too much time over here. It's time, it's time. My Uncle Jack would say, thanks for coming, thanks for going. Sei gesund und stark, right? It was the last thing he ever said to me. I came to visit him. It was right before my mother's 80th birthday. I wanted him to make a video, so he didn't want to do it. He was embarrassed. So I recorded him being embarrassed. At the end, he said, no, enough already. Thanks for coming, thanks for going. He went me out the door. Thanks for coming, thanks for going. Sei gesund und stark. If you want, I can send you the video of it. It's great. Anyway, God is saying over here, again, that's what Moshe is saying. You spend too much time, so let's continue. Let's continue. But you already just now heard exactly, precisely, no confusion, what the objective, the starting of the book, what the objective is. The objective is, go inherit the land. Continue. Pasuk Tet, then, is really interesting. That's one we're going to have to come back to. And I said to you at that time, now part of the issue will be, what is that time? What is the ba'etahi? And we have a lot of these dangling references taking place throughout the chapter. And I said to you ba'etahi at that time. What did you say? Sorry. Well, okay, good. So hold on to whatever our possibilities are. Good. I am in Pasuk Tet. Pasuk Chet said, go to the land. The Pasuk Tet is, Moshe then says, Va'omer lechem be'etah lemar. I said to you at that time, Lo uchal levadi se'etetchem. I cannot do this by myself. Continue in Pasuk Yod, Hashem lekeim ibiritchem, v'nichem ayom k'choch ve'eshmaim l'rov. God has made you so numerous, and you are like the stars of the sky. There's so many of you. By the way, that's really interesting. When you're back in Bereshit and you're sitting around the table and you say, God promised to make them as, again, a Bereshit reference, God promised to make you as numerous as the stars in the sky. When does that come to fruition? According to Moshe, here you have in Sefer Devarim, Moshe says it comes to fruition. By the way, you could say this as a blessing, or you can say it as Moshe saying, listen, this is overwhelming. There's an awful lot of you, and I cannot do this by myself. So now, that's one thing we're going to come back to. Continue, Pasuk Yud Bet. I'm skipping a little bit. How can I possibly do this by myself? Now, the thing that I already hinted at before I started, these comments are interesting. Because here Moshe, instead of trying to build his legacy, he's mentioning his vulnerability. Instead of saying, well, look at the wonderful job that he did, he's admitting, saying, and I had a hard time doing this. Again, you go back to Moshe at the sneh, and you have an honest reporting of what happened there. Moshe then said, I'm not the one. You have better people to do it. And over here, Moshe says, this was an overwhelming thing, and I felt I couldn't do it. Now, right over there, at the end of Pasuk Yud Bet, I skipped from Yud Gimel to Kaf Aleph. But what I skipped over there is God's response, okay, you need help, and then appointing people. So at this point, I want to stop. There are two times in the Torah where we find this support staff being appointed. One was when Yitro arrives in Parshat Yitro, and the other one is in Parshat Balotcha. Now, if I wouldn't know better, my focus would have been, or should have been, or is, on Parshat Balotcha, for a very simple reason. The starting point was that we spent too much time on the mountain, and it was time to move. In which parsha, when did we leave the mountain? When did we arrive by the mountain? By the way, it takes us to the other one. We arrived in Parshat Yitro, right in Perek Yutet, in Shemot. That's when we arrived by the mountain. We were by that mountain, throughout the rest of Sefer Shemot, throughout all of Sefer Vayikra, beginning of Sefer Bamidbar, and at which point do we actually start moving? So then we get to Parshat Balotcha. In Balotcha, we start to go. In Parshat Balotcha, like in Parshat Yitro, you have Yitro in both of them. Although he's called Chovav in the other one, we assume our favorite theory of conservation of characters, and they're both called Moshe's father-in-law, so we assume that this is the same person. That's the Rashi tells us that he had 7 different names, and you know all of that. What happens afterwards is that other people are appointed. Now, one year I gave a shiur comparing those two sections, and because they sound completely different until you read those verses I just now skipped, which is why I skipped them. Again, you need more homework, because again, I don't trust you during the summer off on your own. I don't know what kind of trouble you'll get yourselves into. So another thing that you should do is to compare the section which is in Balotcha with the appointment of the people. Compare that to Yitro, where we have the appointment of the people, and then compare it to how it's described over here, because this is actually the link between those two. Because those two sound different until you read over here, and this actually merges those two sections together, and it at least creates some kind of a challenge, at least in the way that Moshe is telling it over. But I'm skipping that because that's not my interest right now. But I do have 2 possibilities when Moshe is going to need help. This one here, by saying that I can't do this on my own, that reminds us of Balotcha, where Moshe says, I can't do this on my own. So therefore, if I had to then fill this in, that's what we're up to. But nonetheless, it's the vulnerability, it's the humanity, that's part of it. You know, we never crossed over that step of turning Moshe into more than he was. We actually did the opposite. We turned him into less than what he was. But it's very, very human. And Moshe saying, I can't do this. And then we're skipping how God solves the problem. Pasuk of Aleph. Again, we're right back to the same point. So now we have the whole support staff. Now we have people. So now what is the time to? Alei reish kasher diber Hashem Elokei avotecha lach al tirava al techat. Yalla. Right? That's what the Torah just now said. Yalla. Time to go. Move on. I mean, are you getting the focus yet of what we are dealing with? And then it gets to the next point. V'tukravune lai kulchem, you all approached me, v'tamru, and you said, Nishtachan Hashem lefanenu, v'chapru lanu et haaretz, v'yashivu otanu davar, et haderech hashana leba, v'et harim asher navo alehem, which is the suggestion to send the spies. Over here, the way it's presented here, it starts as a grassroots movement. The people come and say that we think that we need to send people. For, again, the next step, let's do this in a responsible way. You don't want to be irresponsible in terms of how we're going to do this. And in Pasuk Kaf Gimel, Moshe says something that he doesn't have to admit, or he doesn't have to say, or in retrospect, whatever. Pasuk Kaf Gimel, v'yitav beinai davar, and I thought it was a good idea. And we all know this is not going to work out very well. If you want, we can read the rest of the section over here. And so it's interesting. We spent too much time in the mountain. So you all know the Rashi probably, no? The whole thing about the days Zahav, too much gold, and about and beneath the surface here is the golden calf. But the golden calf is beneath the surface, not because of days Zahav, really. Why is it beneath the surface? Because you spend too much time on this mountain. That's why it's there beneath the surface, which means there's a hint at that sin, and that causes this whole delay. And then you have over here, we're getting up to that next sin, and what do we have in the background? Get up and go. It's time to move. You've been here too long. What's the next step in history? But we have to, by the way, keep on repeating that to people. What is the next step in history? God gave us the land. What's the next step? Pick up and move. Go to the land which God has given us. Do I need to be any clearer over here? Right? So I'm just, again, this is what Moshe is saying. And then he admits, and again, this is just so remarkable, because you would not have leaders today possibly admit. They'll say, you guys had this idea, and just leave it at that and say, oh, look how this worked out terribly. But instead, Moshe says something which is absolutely, completely fascinating. He continues and he says, Ve'ekach, and then it talks a little bit about the spies. Pasuk Lamed Aleph, I skipped over here. There should be a couple dots. Uvamidbar asher re'ita asher nisacha Hashem lokecha kasher yisa ishet beno b'chol haderech asher lachtem ad bochem ad makom hazeh. ובדבר זה אינכם מאמינים בהשם אלוקיכם, הולך לפניכם בדרך לתור לכם, מקום לחנותכם, באש לילה לרדכם, בדרך אשר תלכו בה ובנן ימם. Pause just to understand what just now happened. The spies come back with their negative appraisal on how we can't do it, and Moshe says to them, you didn't believe in God because God who's been carrying us out, taking care of us this whole way, dealing with all the issues that we have. So what in the world happened to you? Now, the word used in Pasuk Lamed Bet, I'm going to come back to, Ma'minim, I bolded that, I want to come back to that, because that also is really interesting, so hold on to that for a moment, we're just making a note of that. Pasuk Lamed Daled, Vayishma Hashem, it's called Divreichem, Vayiksof, Vayishav Alimar, and God was quite upset with you. I mean, they're all distraught, and they're all upset, and they're all crying, and so on and so forth, and God swore, Im Yireh, Ish ban Hashem Eila Dor Hara Hazeh Ta'aretz Tova Asher Nishbati Latet Lachateichem. Again, the land is still the focus. You have proven yourselves undeserving of this land. Zulatit Kalav ben Yefuna Hu Yir'ena V'lo Etena Ta'aretz Asher Darachba Ulevanav Yan Asher Milei Acharei Hashem. The exception will be Kalav ben Yefuna. He's going to receive the land which he tread upon. Right, again, echoes of Abraham, and because he followed God. And then Moshe adds in something which will again need us to, to understand this and to explain this. Pasuk Lamed Zayim, Gambian hitanaf Hashem biglalchem lemor, and God got upset with me because of you saying Gamata lo tavo sham. You're also not going to go there. Pasuk Lamed Chet Yeshua ben Nun Omeid lefnecha hu yavo shama oto chazaki hu yenchalot Yisrael. Yeshua is going to lead. So Kalev and Yefuna. Kalev and Yoshua are both mentioned, but they're separated by a pasuk, and the pasuk they're separated from is where Moshe is doing, in a sense, the opposite of what we had noted till this point, where he is admitting his own weaknesses and his own problems. Over here, he's saying, yeah, and I'm not going also because of you. Now, all of us know that Moshe is kind of skipping over another episode which happened, and why is he pointing the finger at them instead of taking responsibility here? Which means Moshe is taking responsibility in places that he shouldn't necessarily take responsibility, and he's not taking responsibility in the place that he should be taking responsibility. And being that all of this is within a couple of verses one of another, we are somewhat confounded, and I hope now you understand what we're going to be trying to figure out over here. So what exactly is taking place, and what is Moshe doing? Is there more for us to say? Vayomer Hashem Elai Amor Lahem Pasuk Membet Lo talu, right? You guys are not going. This is already the continuation. The Mapilim who wanted to go anyway, we spoke about a month ago or so. It's just not going to work. And I told you not to go. You rebelled against the word of God. And again, some people went nonetheless. They brazenly went up the mountain, and so on, and they vayaku and they beat you, and so on. And you came back. By the way, this is actually much more of a religiously justified and understandable response. You came back, and you cried in front of God. And God did not listen to you. V'lo ha'ezin aleichem, right, and did not hear what you had to say. V'teshvu b'kadesh yamim rabim k'yamim asher yashaftem, and then you spent a lot more years in Kadesh. Now, all of this is interesting because later on in Parshat V'etchanan, we're going to hear that Moshe is going to pray and God's not going to listen to his prayer. Over here, he's saying about the same point, about, could we go in anyway? And the answer is no. And if the starting point was you spent too much time on this mountain, you had the next chapter in history you're supposed to go to, and right, the destiny that you were supposed to head towards, and you just kept delaying it, and now what are we told as we end this chapter? And now you ended up delaying it, a lot more time, which means till now the delay was roughly a year, and now the delay is going to be another 38 plus years. So essentially, you realize how tragic this whole description is. Moshe's focus is what that next chapter is supposed to be, and what it is right now. I mean, that's what we're up to now. Don't mess up again. What are we up to now? This perpetual next chapter in history. It's always Lashana Haba B'Yushalayim, but people can't take that next step. I've said before that for a lot of people, it's always going to be Lashana Haba. I mean, the only thing is they buy graves in Jerusalem and they don't want to say Lashana Haba B'Yushalayim because it's the only way they see themselves getting here. But I'll behave. So, look, I even got to her. Look at that. But again, it's always Lashana Haba Yerushalayim, but it's always tomorrow, it's always next year, it's always going to be later, and that's part of what we're up to right now. How long are we going to keep on pushing this off? It was supposed to be all along the way the next step, and look what's happened. So I'm saying that's the speech. Essentially, I've already said to you what I want to figure out. I want to understand some of the references that what was Moshe's making. I want to understand when Moshe's taking responsibility. I want to understand there were a couple of words along the way that we needed to come back to. And then the time that Moshe turns around and does the opposite and says, guys, it's your fault. So what just now happened? Because it seems to be a little combination of opposites. Is that good? Yes, that's good. So going back to Pasuk Tet, which really where we began, in a sense, Vayomer Lechem Be'etahi, this is when Moshe said, I can't do it by myself. In source number 2, the Vilna Gaon, and I don't want to fool you here, it was a lot longer, and he gave all kinds of other interpretations, but at some point he has an admission, and that's what we're about to read, Be'etahi, Lefi Pshuto, but what's Pshat? Right? Lefi Pshuto, source number 2, Lefi Pshuto, source number 2, Lefi Pshuto, Haya B'Shana HaShenit L'Tze'etam B'Mitzrayim B'Shat HaDegalim, which means, where is this? It's in Parshat Ba'alotcha. Exactly where we thought it should be. Why? Because that's where Moshe says, I can't do this. I mean, he actually says it much stronger. Right, that's when Yitro Achoviv goes, meaning what the Vilna Gaon is saying is what I had suggested before as being the obvious interpretation of what's taking place in this section is that this first reference is when we actually left the mountain, and when did we actually leave the mountain? Answer, we left the mountain in Parshat Balotcha. By the way, we didn't work out well. There were all kinds of problems and mistakes. We started complaining and so on. The Asaf Suf, and so we know that didn't work out well, but let's continue. Which means, again, Parshat Bamidbar was okay from Perek Aleph through Perek Yud. At the end of Perek Yud, we already get the hint, and then from Yud Aleph, right, I've already said that chapter 11 is bankruptcy, moral bankruptcy, spiritual bankruptcy, chapter 11, very easy to remember. Okay? In source number 3, the Bechor Shur writes, Be'etahi, Kishaba Yitro, now that's fascinating because he completely ignored a lot of what it said over here, but he noted what I noted. And what's that? That there's a similarity to the way that the description, which I skipped here, with what was described in Parshat Yitro. So therefore, instead of bringing it at the time that Yitro leaves, which, by the way, at the moment that Yitro leaves, what does Moshe feel? Moshe feels very vulnerable. Yitro was a person who was probably, again, I'm filling in blank spaces here. I don't know how long Moshe lived with Yitro. Was it 20 years? Was it 30 years? Was it 40 years? Could have been 40 years that he lived there with Yitro. Yitro himself is described as Kohen Midyan. We don't know if it's religious or if it's political. He's a leader. He has a leadership position. For him to walk in and to analyze how Moshe's leadership is being utilized, and you may get overwhelmed like this, here's an idea to be a little bit more pragmatic and practical in how to do it. So therefore, the appointment of all these people, did it take place when Yitro comes and then gives his suggestions? Or is it when Yitro leaves and then Moshe feels overwhelmed because Yitro is the one guy that he could probably turn to who's had experience as a leader and say, listen, what do we do now? And don't leave. I need you with me over here, which again is a sense of vulnerability. But as I'm going to say it again, what the Bechor Shor just now did is that he moved this over to when Yitro arrives instead of when Yitro leaves, and that's interesting. I'm not going to get into all the details of what motivates him. I've already given you enough hints about that, but nonetheless, that moves things dramatically. In source number 4, the Ramban, and the Ramban's always going to be interesting when he deals with timing, because the Ramban's default always going to be is that there's chronological integrity, everything follows the proper sequence unless there's some kind of manifest reason to say otherwise. So we're going to read the Ramban. You're going to see how he's like dancing over here to try to avoid something which he considers to be a problem. Kodem sha'amar lanu Hashem b'chorev rav lechem shevet b'har zeh. He just now did invert the sequence. He said that this happened before God said, by the way, all that he just now did, he's making reference in Pasuk Tet to something, and he was making reference in Pasuk Vav to something, and now the Ramban is claiming that that didn't happen in that sequence. That when Moshe is telling things over, by the way, this doesn't deal with real sequence issues, but he's just saying that Moshe is not telling things over in the order that it happened. And he says, no, this happened beforehand. Al dat ha'omrim kodin matan Torah ba Yitro. If one is going to claim that Yitro came before Matan Torah. Now, he's bothered by the same thing that the Bechor Shur is bothered by. Now, I don't want to overly complicate this. When does Yitro come? Some say he can, again, Vayishma Yitro, he heard. What did he hear? Some say he heard about all the Makot, or he heard about the splitting of the sea, he heard about Muhammad Amalek, or he heard Matan Torah. Especially when he's telling him, when you're going to sit and judge the people based upon what? So there's an argument to be made that Yitro's arrival is after the Torah is given, and now you need to know how to adjudicate and so on. So I'm going to say it again, the Ramban is dancing a little bit over here, so just note that. And then he says, "Vatam be'etahi b'shavtenu b'chorev, aval hiskir ze bekan lomar hine kibalnu et Torah v'yolechem shoftim v'shotim l'shpot lanegatchem." No, we received the Torah v'nei hayinu muchonim uzmanim levo ba'aretz v'nasam michor v'ledaglenu im shoftenu v'zaknenu v'tekrevun elai kulchem im chachmechem v'roshechem u'barakshim araglim v'nitchakel inyan. So you know what the Ramban just really did? He tried to bring together Moshe's speech. What does the appointed people have to do with the Meraglim? And he's essentially seeing that the leaders which are approached are part of this coalition which is being formed, which are going to approach Moshe for the next episode. Essentially, the Ramban is trying to tighten everything that we've read till now, but along the way to do that, he probably confused most of us. Yes? Yes. Okay? And that's okay, because at least when you know you're confused, then you're not as confused as when you don't know that you're confused. I want to now go back to Parshat Yitro and point at something which arguably we never paid attention to, and then we're going to see how it's important and how it's used, but it's going to help us to do what the Ramban just now wanted us to do. And what's that? Tighten everything and understand how this was a really well-crafted speech and what exactly it was that Moshe is doing and how we got to where we got to. In source number 5, Yitro arrives, and then he says, but you need to divide, and you need to have the judges of the, whatever it was, the 50, 100, and so on and so forth. And V'shavtu et ha'am b'chol eitz, v'yakol devar hagadol yaviu elecha, v'kol devar katon yishpetu heim v'akel me'elecha v'nasu itach. Again, big things go to you, small things go to the judges, and so on. Pasuk Kaf Gimel, im et ha'davar hazeh ta'aseh, v'tzivcha elokim v'yachol ta'amod. If you do this with God's approval, you'll be able to survive and to stand. V'gam kol ha'am hazeh al mekomo yavo b'shalom. And all these people then will be able to go to their place in peace. Now, what in the world did that last phrase mean? So note the Ibn Ezra in source number 6. Note the Ibn Ezra in source number 6 is his Perish HaOrach. It's his long commentary. That's the way it's called. And he had multiple commentaries. Vitam, he tells us, again, the Ibn Ezra in Shemot, Vitam v'gam kol ha'am hazeh ki ba'alei hariv shayun tzavim lefanav, right? All these people were fighting and so on and so forth, and I'm skipping a little bit here. Rakata yavo kol achad el makomo she'u ohalo b'shalom. So he's saying everyone go back to their tent in peace, which means this really is going to lead us to the Ma Tovu Alecha Yaakov Mishkanech Techi Yisrael. Everyone's going to be essentially. You have people fighting, you have the judges making peace, and everybody can go to their tent at the end of the day, and everybody's happy. And we're therefore going to have a unified community which is able to live together in peace. And that's the way the Ibn Ezra suggests that's what it means. In source number 7, you have the Ibn Ezra in his Perish HaKatzar, which is a bit longer than his Perish HaAruch. And he says, Al Mekomo, El Makom, Eretz Canaan. And then he let the Zionism slip out, and he said that, if we do this and we become unified, then we can go to our place. So what's our place? So that's really interesting. That in one commentary he writes, and by the way, even better, in the next line he writes, El Makomo, one second, in source number 7. And some people say it's their tent. Yes, that was you who wrote it. I'm sure there are others as well, but that's really interesting, because in his 2 commentaries he says 2 different things, and in one of them he quotes what he writes in the other one, and then he kind of disassociates himself from it. But this is radically different. Yes, where is our place? Is this totally going to be a diaspora perspective, right? In terms of each person in their own communities, in their own tents, and we live in peace and harmony, and everything is great? Or do we have this macro view of Jewish history and saying, where is our place? Where is home? Where are you supposed to go? And therefore, you just now understand that those are just 2 so radically different understandings of reading that section. You don't know where I'm going with all of this yet, so just give it a second and look at number 8, that Rav Hirsch says, it says al mikomo and not el mikomo, and then he takes it and he goes in source number 8, he goes even further and he says that each person should know their place, which just, it's a very nice teaching, but has nothing to do with, by the way, it's nothing to do with judges. Read what he says. Everybody should know their proper place and their level and what they do. That's the main job of a judge. I don't know what he's talking about. So, but again, it's so interesting how you can take this and contextualize it within your own lives and what you think it means, or you say, now, what's the bigger story over here? We're going to skip and go over to source number 10, which is the... by the way, I won't skip. The Netziv in source number 9 says, what does it mean? El Makomo is that by having so many judges, then you don't have to go far to find litigation. You don't, or in the president, to solve any kinds of problems. Everything's local, right here, which means you don't have to go and travel a long way to go to court. Everything gets solved immediately, and that's the way that it is. And he says that's pshat. L'fi pshat, shelo yu nitzrachem lelechet lemirchok levakesh mishpat ela b'mokomo yavo b'shalom. There'll be peace locally, and everything's great. Kli Yakar does what he's supposed to do, and it's great what he does, and I'm going to explain why I'm saying that. First of all, the Kli Yakar is not in Shemot. Where is it? It's here, in Devarim, what we're up to. What is the Kli Yakar trying to understand? He's trying to understand Moshe's speech. By the way, that's what the Ramban was doing as well. What exactly is the flow over here between Moshe saying, with too much time on the mountain, I can't do this on myself, appointment of others in order to help, and then the Meraglim, and so on, which means what is the flow of what just now happened? Now, all of you can just now say to me, well, that's what happened. But you realize that Moshe is starting at a particular place. He's leading a particular episode. He's including certain things. He's not including everything, which means what's here and why. So now go to the Kli Yakar. V'amur lechem be'etahi lemor, be'etahi mor be'etzba, like pointing at a finger, alazman she'amur lahem bo'ov reshua ta'aretz, which means this, what is this point? The point is that God said, you're too much time in the mountain, go to the land. Now Moshe is really referring to what? To the next step. What's the next step? Is the conquest, going to the land. So in order to go to the land, we need certain things in order. And he says, Ki yu'itich zman hu tzarich now just look down at source number 11 to see exactly the context. Parshat Shoftim Tim B'chol Sha'arecha. Right? The laws of appointing judges. By the way, it's one of the 7 Noachide laws. You can say to me, okay, why is that special over here? It's not just one of the Noachide laws. You look at Pasuk Kaf, again, 3 Pasukim down there in source 11, Tzedek, Tzedek, Terdov, you all remember that Pasuk, except for the second half of it. Tzedek, Tzedek, Terdov, Liman, Tichyeh, V'yorashta et ha'aretz, asher Hashem Elokecha notein lach. What's the reason that you need justice? In order to be deserving to live in the land. The land is a land which desires, which needs certain type of behavior, and the basic thing here is we need judges. Now go back to the Kli Yakar, because what he's writing is fascinating. He says that, okay, time to go to the land, and Moshe says, I need help. Why? Because we're going to need to create a justice system when we're going to get to the land, because that's one of the laws which are required in the land. Moshe Namar said that I'm in the Kli Yakar, Leman Tichev Yerasha Ta'aretz. Pirish Rashi, Gedayu Mina Dayanim Ksherim L'chiot et Yisrael L'shivam El D'matam. Having proper justice is part of what's going to allow us to be there. And then he continues, V'chein Pirashnu Lamala B'Parshat Yitro. And that's how I explained it back in Yitro when it said, Kol ha'amazeh el makamo yavo b'shalom. The appointment of judges is going to allow us to live in the land. By the way, just think a second. Back in Yitro, we made our short stop, not a short stop, Michael, I don't want you to think, I say short stop, he's thinking Derek Jeter still, okay? We were supposed to make our short stop in Sinai, receive the Torah, and what's the next step? Well, it's interesting. What's the next step? Parshat Mishpatim. What's the next step? Is we need to create a justice system. Where? In the land of Israel. What are we not supposed to do? Spend too much time by the mountain. So the Kli Yakar is saying yes, is that this is part of the setup in order to go in, which actually therefore means that when we have this whole issue of the judges the first time and the second time, it's dealing with the same larger issue, and that is the judges in context of going into the land of Israel, and he goes and connects them, but he also brought it into our narrative, and he made our narrative a little bit tighter. Good. Let's now move over to the second part. In right before source 12, I quoted a verse there. And the verse is, Vayitev b'nai hadavar. And Moshe says, no, I thought it was a good idea as well. Right? So that is the spies, and Moshe is saying, yeah, I approved of this. And we all realize he didn't have to do that. Rashi points out, and again, if you want, you can have Rashi as for more homework. But he does point out that I thought it was good, but nonetheless, well, let's read. B'nai v'lo b'nei makom. But God didn't think it was good, which is also really interesting. Yeah, God thought this was bad, so why proceed? If Moshe thought it's a good idea, why is he giving them a rebuke about this now? Well, we know why he's giving a rebuke, because of the horrific consequences. I'm going to skip the rest of Rashi. Ibn Ezra, source 13. V'yitav be'inai hadavar, b'vor shekulchem hiskamtem al zeh. Why did I agree? Because you all agreed. Now, this is actually really interesting. And I want you to understand it much more in terms of the flow, as we had just saw a moment ago. We create a justice system. To create justice creates peace. Different opinions, we're able to work it out, and then we could be of one mind. The entire people of one mind, and they come to me and says, let's do something. So now should Moshe be against them, or Moshe should support them because that's the will of the people? Now, I'm not going all the way to law. I'm not going to talk about democracy. I'm not going to talk about the will of the people and so on and so forth. But what I am going to talk about is what Ibn Ezra just now said, is that Moshe sees that there's a sense of unity, so why? No, I don't want to break that unity. The fact that everybody wants something, that itself is good, which means it is more of a question of procedure than it is a question of content. And Moshe goes along with it because, okay, the people are all together. Okay, let's go. That's a good meaning. The fact that people are unified is itself something which is good. So that is that itself is a really interesting comment. Pasuk Lamed Bet, look right before 15. U'b'davar hazeh eincha ma'minim b'Hashem Elokeichem. And when it comes to this, you did not believe in God. Now, over here, I brought you a number of different comments regarding this to try to explain this, but I need to give you a little bit more information. Part of what bothers me with this is that it's a really interesting word for Moshe to use, of all people, in this speech. When Moshe sins by hitting the rock, God comes and says, Yan lo hemantim bi laktisheni, because you did not believe in me. And when Moshe is now going to speak about, and you didn't believe in God, so it's really interesting because of lack of belief is something which should be a sore point, but nonetheless, Moshe over here identifies this. By the way, the sequence, we need to pay attention. Parshat Shlach takes place before that episode, in terms of hitting the rock, but nonetheless it's interesting. The other thing is always to pay attention with Moshe with Emunah. I mean, you go back to the other rock story, hitting the rock, right afterwards you have Mechemed Amalek, and then it says that Yedei Moshe Emunah, right, the hands of Moshe Emunah, which means try to go, Vayiminu ba'Hashem of Moshe Avto, by the way, also with the staff and with water, right, splitting the sea. There's also this whole idea that Moshe instilling them in faith or not is interesting when it says, well, you guys didn't believe. So I need to explain that a little bit more. Let's see how much time we have, and let's try to do as much as we can. Uvadevar hazeh, the OURA Chaim in source 15. Sarach ladat kavanatam uvadevar hazeh. Rashi's al pirish alav tachbiyat haaretz. Umedaber ve'ein nira. He says, then it says, and you didn't believe. Rashi is saying that's talking about you didn't believe that God had promised land. Again, the context here is the spies. The spies come back, and they and it says that you didn't have belief. And Rashi didn't believe in terms of the land that God had really promised the land. Ve'ein nira. Kahn, Ella Kipshat Katuv. Shall only say midbar. Who asher nasam Hashem. No, it's exactly what it says over here. If you read the verses again, it says you didn't believe. God is the one who carried you along. He did all the miracles for you, and essentially your lack of belief is actually preposterous. How do you ignore all of the evidence standing in front of you and suddenly, oh no, we can't just do that next step, right? This is not possible. This in 16, the Netziv, B'davar hazeh, you didn't believe, B'masha Amar, Hashem Bahar Chorev, Bo'er Rishuot Aretz. Right, again, getting the larger context of this speech. You didn't believe in terms of the next stage. Go and conquer the land. You just didn't believe you could do it. The Shlah HaKadosh in 17, Gam Hayta Gezerah Kedumazu Mitzad Yisrael. Now, I want to explain to you why I'm here. I'm here because I looked for the thing I just now told you a moment ago. What is it? That by Moshe's hitting the rock, it talks about a lack of emunah, and here it talks about a lack of emunah. And I looked and I searched, does anybody connect them? And the answer is, the only one I really saw was the Shlah. I'm not saying there are none there, I'm saying this is what I found. So he starts off by telling us something which is, it's not so simple. He says, now, he's in Parshat Chukat. Where's Chukat? Where Moshe hits the rock. And he's saying is that Moshe hitting the rock is not really the reason he's not going to go into the land. He says right away, Gam hayta gzeira k'dumazu mitzad Yisrael, that this punishment already had existed prior to this, and the punishment was not on Moshe, the punishment was on the people. The people had received the punishment. What's the punishment? Shelo hayu ru'uyim Yisrael sheyeh manhigam la'eretz Yisrael Moshe Rabbeinu alav shalom. They were undeserving to have a leader like Moshe bring him into the land of Israel. Essentially, he's going to tell us that the whole rock episode is not what you think it is, because there already was a decree that these people can't have Moshe leading them. Oh, now this is absolutely frightening. He continues and he explains, we're going to skip a little bit. And now you understand why Moshe, this is our other problem, why Moshe says, and because of you. What did one thing after the other? Why did Moshe say, because of you I can't go in? Again, that was the part that was a little difficult. Tiv it says, Yan lo himantim bi. Here it says, because you didn't believe in me. V'sham ktiv udvar hazeh einam chaminim, because you don't believe. Elosod ha'inyan hu kitipirashti. The secret behind all of this is, as I explained, hagzera haitakduma. There already was a prior decree that God had given. Shehit aber Hashem b'Moshe b'avor Yisrael b'bnei chata'am hakadum. That the people were already guilty because of their earlier sin that had taken place. Rak sha'ata yatsa mikoach al poel. And now it switched from the theoretical into the actual. V'zeh inyan hema me'ivasha ravu b'nei Yisrael. And these are the warders which the Bnei Yisrael quarreled with God, the Hevin, and understand this. So again, this is perhaps a radical interpretation, but we're just warming up. The OURA Chaim, it's interesting, the Shlah is always called the Shlah HaKadosh, and the OURA Chaim is called the OURA Chaim HaKadosh, and apparently they understand Kedusha maybe a little bit better than most. And the OURA Chaim over here is going to do something similar, but a little bit different. He's also troubled by the same thing. What does it mean when Moshe says, and God got upset with me because of you? Gam biyat tanaf Hashem b'galchem. Kasha. V'lo matzim tanaf Hashem Moshe b'manim meraglim. Go read through Parshat Shlach. You don't find it all that God was upset with Moshe. Maybe Moshe says, yeah, I agreed, I like the idea, and God was mad with me. What in the world are you talking about? Ramban Pirish v'amar v'oda saftim l'ra pamacheret. And the Ramban says it is a, what's the word for this? It is a, it's disconnected. That Moshe is kind of like free wheeling over here, right? And it's just disconnected, and he mentioned it in passing. He goes, "V'Ramban pirish v'Omar v'od hasaftem l'ra pamacheret at you going to l'tanf." And on top of all other things that you've done, you got me so angry that I had to go and hit them and so on. V'ein advarim nira. He goes, I don't know what he's talking about. No, but right after the next passage, he goes back to the Meraglim. Shekena marachar there, v'tapchem amartu, and so on. Ad sofa haperik. And it's exclusively about the Meraglim from this point onwards. Like, why did he stop in the middle and then add this point about, and God was mad about me? Umashi litz harav, and that which the Ramban suggested, I have no idea why he thinks that this makes any sense. Then, taking a deep breath, and again, this is the Orach Chaim here in Devarim, and then he says, "V'hanachonhu," but the proper understanding of all this is, "Al pi divrechem," and now he turns this all around a little bit, and it's not that different from the Shla, but he cites this teaching that says that had Moshe gone into Eretz Yisrael, and Moshe built the Beit HaMikdash, that Beit HaMikdash would not and could not have ever been destroyed. Because again, go back to holiness, something holy, built by someone holy, it never could have been destroyed. But what's the problem? What happens when God gets angry at the Jewish people? He goes, at that point, will God take out his anger on the people instead of at the building? And therefore, Moshe couldn't go in because of them, which means the Meraglim, the sin of the Meraglim, and so on. Moshe says, now I can't go in because you're going to sin again. It's called B'chiyah L'Dorot. You right? Why are you crying for nothing? I'll give you a reason to cry. And they're going to mess up again. They mess up again. What's God going to do? Is he going to have this building to take down? If Moshe goes in, then he can't. Or is he going to have the people to take down? And essentially what the Orach Chaim does for all of this, source 18, he goes and he explains that no, it can't be that way. In the Orach Chaim also, in source 19, on Bamidbar, on the place over there, he does the same thing. He goes a little bit further there and explains that had Moshe and Aaron, again, Orach Chaim HaKadosh, had they created more Kedusha, that Moshe and Aaron perhaps could have elevated the people by speaking to the rock and making a Kiddush Hashem, and they could have somehow, look at the last couple of lines, She'im hoyu makadshim shem shamayim leinehem, hoyahador hazeh kedor sheben David bo she'ya'avir Hashem et ruach hatuma u'mala ha'aretz de'ah et Hashem. Moshe and Aaron perhaps could have done something which would have elevated the people, and they would have gotten to this point where they couldn't have sinned. Couldn't is a strong word. I just want to add a little bit to this. Theoretically, by Har Sinai, the same thing should have happened. But what happened after Har Sinai? Then we have an Egel. What happens over here? We're going to have another opportunity to elevate them in front of everybody to see the Kedusha, and instead of elevating them, something happens, and therefore Moshe can't go in. So again, the Orach Chaim is trying to explain why Moshe would mention this in the middle. The Abarbanel, source number 20, and you need to know this Abarbanel, it's radical, and he thinks it's radical, and he says, look, in second paragraph in source 20, Uma ra'a Moshe Rabbeinu olav Hashem lachnis gzerato b'tochem meraglim b'gzeratam shelo yival haaretz. Same question. Why is he bringing this in over here? V'yadua sheyesod inyan hazeh hu yidiyat chet Moshe v'Aaron. In order to do this, you need to understand the real idea behind what the sin of Moshe and Aaron was. She'olav nitchayvu lamut v'shelo yival haaretz. The reason why they had to die, they couldn't go into the land. V'hu drush amok mi'imtzenu. And it's very deep for those can actually go and be able to penetrate this. And my opinion is different from everybody till now. And then he goes on and explains it. And if you want, it's bold a couple lines later. And we have the Abarbanel here in Devarim, and again by the hitting of the rock. And what does he say here? Where it's bold in source 20, he writes, Va'omer shedati bezehu she'aron kadosh Hashem meit ba'avon ha'egel u'Moshe Adonenu meit ba'avon ha'meraglim. So he just now said Moshe and Aaron did not die because of hitting the rock. I just think for a second. Hitting the rock, it seems minor in terms of look at larger issues. How could it be, this is part of where he's coming from, how could it be that Aaron, who's involved actively in the Egel, and you could defend him if you want, is going to not be punished for that, but when it comes to The hitting of the rock where you're standing on the side as Moshe hits the rock. Oh, now you can't go. Now you're going to die. He says, what are you talking about? Think about consequences. That's part of what this is. Think about consequences. That Moshe, the consequence of Moshe agreeing to send them is that they're going to come back and it's all going to mess up and they're going to be punished for 38 years. The consequences are so much stronger than the consequence of hitting the rock and so on. So what he's saying over here is that's reality. God doesn't want to say it that way, which means those people who actually did the egel are sinners and those people who are meraglim are actually the sinners. And there's something inappropriate of saying, yeah, Aaron was one of them and Moshe was one of them, because that's not right. But nonetheless, he says, but that's the truth. And Moshe knows it. And what's really interesting then is, do you realize what Moshe then is doing by saying, oh, because of you I got punished as well? Moshe is actually not pointing an accusative finger. Moshe is actually taking responsibility for being involved in the Eichel as well. When I told you that Moshe over here, talking about the legacy and being worried about how he's going to be seen for posterity, what Moshe is doing every step of the way over here is taking responsibility. And that point about Amunah then becomes also a little bit more interesting, which means we have a people who are unified, right? And we have the judges and trying to bring them all together, and they're unified, and they have belief. I missaid that before. They had belief. What was the problem? They believe in Meraglim, and they don't believe in Moshe. And by the way, that's the problem all the way through. They don't believe enough in Moshe. If they would have believed more in Moshe, then all the problems that we had all along the way, again, every time they get worked up and get upset, they don't even believe in Moshe. Think about the Egel where they don't believe in Moshe. Oh, Moshe's not here. He must be dead. No, this is Moshe Rabbeinu. He went up to God. Moshe's going to be back. But they don't believe in Moshe enough. So this lack of belief is what's really interesting over here. And Moshe, instead of accusing them, is actually taking responsibility because he is including himself in the sin of the spies. And I am involved in this also. So therefore, at least according to the Abarbanel, question is if we convinced any of you to accept the Abarbanel, but the Abarbanel works really well to understand the Psukim over here, because otherwise you just have this disconnect in the middle over here, and it just doesn't make sense why this fits in. So then I'll say it again. Moshe's speech from the beginning of this parsha to the end of the parsha is about one thing. It's about going to the land of Israel. And what's the problem? The problem is that we've delayed and we've taken missteps, and we did not do what we needed to do when we needed to do it. And essentially, there's one reason why he's giving this speech. What's the real reason? The real reason is, what's the next step going to be? Are you going to repeat the same mistakes, or are you going to go further? Which means there needs to be belief. There needs to be belief in their leaders. There needs to be belief in God. Not suddenly find your inner belief when the Meraglim come up against the evidence which is staring in front of you. And Moshe, all along the way over here, includes himself in the problems which exist, which is absolutely fascinating. But he's doing this, as I said, because he's honest and because he's taking responsibility, and he wants to make sure that the mistakes that have already happened don't happen again. So what's the next step in history? The next step is it's time to pick up and move to Israel. That's what it says. If a couple days before Tisha B'Av a person can't understand it, then I don't know when they'll actually be able to understand this.